is a pleasure to be with you again for Mondays at Beinecke. It certainly feels like home, and it's even more of a pleasure to be with you this afternoon because I get to share with you about a little known figure, I would say, a man by the name of George Williamson Crawford. And he certainly, as you can see in the subtitle, led a full life of leadership and service. And in the next slide, you'll see sort of where his origins really formed. George Crawford was born in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, to parents and grandparents who had been enslaved. Very quickly, his parents passed away, and he was being raised by grandparents who became elderly and passed away. And he went to Tuskegee Institute in Tuskegee, Alabama, where he began his formal jump into education. Now, the interesting thing is that, as you can see in this slide, at Tuskegee, it was sort of in blossom and bloom, a project of the well-known Booker T. Washington. He entered the Black Belt of Alabama to form a school that was modeled after, initially, Hampton Institute in Virginia, where he attended. And so literally by hand, he and the students built this institution. And in the next slide, we'll get a chance to see a bit about the man who really had a very, very strong impact on the early life of George Crawford. Now, it's interesting because Booker T. Washington himself had been born enslaved, a Black mother who had been enslaved, and a white father. And his opportunity at Hampton really set him on a course to change his life from former slave into a man who literally ended up being tantamount to a kingmaker. And so Booker T. Washington is the founder and principal of what was becoming the famous Tuskegee Institute. He started out life as a noted educational leader, and then that became it positioned him to be a noted civil rights leader, and even, he became a person who was in charge of all patronage for federal jobs, and his power was so vast that he even controlled people who got hired for jobs in municipalities like the local postal worker. Really a man of great influence, and he had the support of very important and rich industrialists. Next slide, please. George Crawford was really in direct contact with Booker T. Washington at Tuskegee. And a funny story says that he was small in stature early on, and he had gotten into a scuffle with a classmate there. And he was so angry at this classmate that he took some typeset and threw it at the individual. And had he made contact with the individual, he would have killed him. And so for that infraction, he was sent to the office of Booker T. Washington. And Booker T. Washington advised him, for such a little person, you pack quite a punch, but you need to be able to control your anger. And I want you to stick close to me, and I'm going to watch over you while you're, here at Tuskegee. And so he became the personal office boy of the school's principal, Booker T. Washington. And after doing successfully, excellently at Tuskegee, he was able to pursue higher education at Talladega College. Now, Talladega also in Alabama was very different from the education that Tuskegee provided students. This was a creation of the American Missionary Association and the Congregational Church. And those folks were people who had worked very early on for the abolition of slavery and then pressured Abraham Lincoln to do something about the institution of slavery just before the Civil War. And so after the war, when there were a number of newly freed, enslaved Black people, the Congregationalists and the American Missionary Association stepped up to provide education for those people. And they did so by opening schools of all kinds throughout the South, including those that focused on collegiate level education, like Talladega College, as you see here at the Savory Library in the background. Talladega was one of the schools, like Fisk, like Howard University, like Atlanta University, that pipelined very, very achieved students into larger universities, many of them being able to have special opportunities at schools like Yale University. And so Talladega was certainly a conduit for Black talent to make their way north to better and bigger schooling. In the next slide, you can see Yale Law School. And after Talladega, George Crawford was able to find his way to Yale Law School, certainly through the relationship with the people at the American Missionary Association. He would have been one of the speakers that Talladega relied on to raise money and go out and talk about the good works there and the really great achievement that Black students were making so quickly. And this puts him in contact with people who would be willing to finance education, and certainly people who were in positions in administrations at schools to mine talent and make a way for him there. And so George was able to come to New Haven and study at the Yale Law School, where initially he worked very hard to supplement his payments at the law school. And in the background, you can see Hendry Hall, where the law school originally was located. Next slide, please. When George Crawford arrived at Yale Law School, he certainly would have known about people who came before him at the law school, like Edwin Archer Randolph, who became Yale Law School's first African-American graduate in 1888. Edwin Randolph was the first Black person to be barred in the state of Connecticut. He then left Connecticut and became an elected city councilman in Richmond, Virginia, and he also was the editor of the Richmond Daily Planet, a very influential Black newspaper. In the next slide, you'll see that he would have also known about early Black Yale law students like Warner McGuinn. Warner McGuinn was a part of a small group of Black attorneys in Baltimore that formed the first Black law firm there. He was a staunch advocate for civil rights. And not only did he do this through organizing and supporting organizations that did direct action on behalf of civil rights, but he also used his law degree to make sure that these things were codified and interrupted in a legal way. And he really was somebody who set the scene for people we know as major civil rights attorneys, people like Belford Lawson and a special person, soon to be future Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall. Thurgood Marshall once said that it should have been Warner McGuinn who became Supreme Court Justice first, in homage to his great work and his prowess. And then also, it's important because Warner McGuinn was an outstanding student in his time at the law school, and his education was partly financed by the famed author Mark Twain. Next slide, please. George Crawford, and this is one of his earliest photos, made quite the record while he was a student at the law school. And you see here a newspaper clipping that announces that in the year 1902 and 1903, Black students made quite a name for themselves in terms of their academic record. Here in this picture, you see William Pickens next to George Crawford. Both men were graduates of Talladega College. Both men were supported by the American Missionary Association and powerful white Congregationalists. Both men relied on each other during their time here at Yale. William Pickens at Yale College and George Crawford at the law school. William Pickens probably, I would say, had more notoriety, but George Crawford was the one who really swept the honors in terms of prizes. Crawford won 3 top prizes: the Whalen Prize for Excellence in Public Debate, the Townsend Prize in Oratory, and the Kent Club Diploma for Debate. William Pickens was noted that year for winning the Tenek Prize. And also, there's a gent who doesn't often get talked about, William Perry, who hailed from North Carolina, had become salutatorian at Hopkins that year, and to great acclaim, accepted a spot at Yale College to enter. And so these men not only represented themselves well, but raised awareness about the presence of Blacks at Yale, and also sort of flew in the face for all the stereotypes related to the intellectual abilities of African Americans. Next slide, please. Now, this is the picture of George Crawford around the time of his graduation from law school. Many of his classmates were leaving, ready to take on the world. Having a Yale law degree at that time certainly put you at the very top of the profession, and certainly would have made you somebody who was to receive offers from the top businesses, top corporations of the day, and certainly the top captains of industry. George Crawford, while watching his classmates go off to major law firms and big jobs, had no job prospects. But he was able to enter the New Haven Probate Court as a clerk, and that's where he started his legal career. And in the next slide, you'll see here it is announced that the prize-winning George Crawford was offered a position in the New Haven probate court, and his first job was as assistant probate clerk. Soon, the chief clerk of the court took sick and took a leave from his job, and Crawford was able to really show his ability by taking over the duties of the chief clerk of the probate court. And in the next slide, you'll see here a newspaper article that bears George Crawford's name as the clerk of the court at the bottom. And so we're lucky to have leftover reminders of his service, which is really important. We're really trying to build an accurate story of someone's life. In the next slide, you'll see how George Crawford came to the probate court. And this is Judge Livingston Warner Cleveland, who himself had graduated from the Yale Law School, scion of a very old family, old New England family. He was elected to the probate court in 1894. It's important that he always liked to remind people that he was a direct descendant of some of the first people to establish America, directly a descendant of then Governor William Bradford of the Mayflower. And it's important to note that he was the grandson of Nathaniel Jocelyn, a very important artist, portrait painter, engraver, and abolitionist. He was also the great nephew of Simeon Jocelyn, who was a noted abolitionist involved in the Underground Railroad, involved in advocating for the rights of New Haven's Black population and America's Black population, certainly noted for his role in helping to mastermind the idea for the 1831 College for Colored Youth. So Judge Cleveland certainly still embodied that old congregational abolitionist spirit. He would have known George Crawford, obviously through the law school, but he would have had an added connection to Crawford through the congregational denomination and the American Missionary Association. And he knew that George Crawford was talented and deserved a chance, and in the spirit of his ancestors, made an opportunity for someone who suffered at the hands of racism. And so it was Judge Cleveland who appointed Crawford to the New Haven Probate Court. Next slide, please. Very quickly, George Crawford established himself at Yale and in the Black community in New Haven. One of the ways he did that was through joining the Dixwell Congregational Church. And here you have the Reverend Edward F. Goen, who was a fellow son of Alabama. Crawford, when he came to New Haven, lived for a period of time with Reverend Goen and his family. They would have had a tie to each other, obviously through Alabama, through Yale, through Congregationalism, through support from the American Missionary Association, and certainly another person who's a link to both of them was Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois. Goen was the longest serving pastor of New Haven's oldest Black church, the Dixwell Congregational Church. He was a graduate of Fisk and Oberlin and Yale, and he helped Crawford and Judge Cleveland to support Clarence Blakesley later on in forming the Dixwell Community House. And they were both charter members of the Greater New Haven chapter of the NAACP. In the next slide, you can see here that Crawford also established himself in the city, not only through Yale and his ties to powerful whites, but certainly being active socially and civically in New Haven's Black community. One of the organizations where he was super active and quickly became leader was in the Prince Hall Masons. And he quickly rose in the lodge, became the worshipful master of the Widow Sons Lodge, the Grand Master of Prince Hall Masons in the entire state of Connecticut, and went on to amazing heights within the Masonic organization. He was noted for being a Masonic legal scholar, and he was an author of a number of Masonic works, and two of them that are well known, Prince Hall and His Followers, and then the Prince Hall Counselor. And then one of his highest offices within that organization was as Sovereign Grand Commander from Consistory number 7. In the next slide, you can also see other hallmarks of his experience with the Masonic organization. And here's a picture of him, obviously in older age, and his regalia from the United Supreme Council. Very well respected amongst Masons, Black and white. And certainly at the time he started affiliating with the organization and working within the organization, the crossover from white Masons to Black Masons wasn't always very easy or accessible. Next slide. Certainly, when you talk about George Crawford, you have to include a figure like W.E.B. Du Bois. Dr. Du Bois was a Harvard graduate, Ph.D. holder, a top scholar who used social science to support his work in advocating for full citizenship rights and civil rights for African Americans. Certainly a proponent that in order to be a full citizen, one must be a fully formed, well-educated, learned in all ways, and in order to be a full man, have access to voting rights and access to exercising those voting rights. And this stood in stark opposition to George Crawford's early mentor, Booker T. Washington, whose focus was business and bucks. And then after you sort of earn your place by showing people that you can make money and be thrifty and be morally upright, you will have earned your place. White society would welcome you knowing that you sort of were capable and able. And so it's interesting because eventually these two schools of thought came into direct conflict, very bitter conflict that sort of was played out all over the country. And George Crawford might have been one of the, only people who was in that position of having such a close early relationship personally with Booker T. Washington, and then a very warm and fraternal relationship with W.E.B. Du Bois. But as you will see, he clearly put himself in the Du Bois camp. And it's important to note that Du Bois also had New Haven roots and ties, as his grandfather, Alexander Du Bois, was a very important figure in the Black community and in the Episcopal Church and the founding of St. Luke's Episcopal Church here in New Haven. Next slide. And this is a letter actually from George Crawford written to W.E.B. Du Bois, where he's talking to him about a visit and having a warm dinner Mrs. Du Bois and Mrs. Crawford and George Crawford and Dr. Du Bois were warm friends, and they visited. And when the Du Boises were in the area passing through or visiting directly the Crawfords, they always stayed with them. And they had a very long-standing warm friendship, which is very interesting because W.E.B. Du Bois wasn't the most wasn't known to be the most friendly, and his relationship with Crawford and a small number of other people who he viewed as intellectual equals was very different from the Du Bois that we get to know as the public. And he and George Crawford carried on the lifelong friendship. In the next slide, you can also see that not only did they discuss sort of friendship things and intimate ties between them, but they definitely were partners in all kinds of work, including research and investigating different political issues and social ills and societal happenings. And they were also, I would say, co-conspirators in making plans for the advancement of whatever cause they were supporting. And in this letter, it's interesting because the subject is Yale Law School, and Crawford and Du Bois were doing some work in regards to the number of African Americans that were attending the law school in the 20s. What came of this conversation, I don't know, but I'm sure it was of some interest to Dr. Du Bois about keeping track of college-educated Black students, particularly their having access to Ivy League educations. Next slide. George Crawford grew from sort of being this young legal dynamo at Yale Law School with sort of beginning access to his career through the probate court into a very active national figure. He would have been outstanding for his achievement in graduating from Yale, but also his prowess to give good, not only legal advice, but strategic advice for advancing causes. And this brought him to the attention of early formers of the Niagara movement, where he served as chair of their Civil Rights Committee. And as that organization dissipated, the NAACP sort of grew out of the spirit of that organization, and George Crawford was one of those early formers. His relationship to the NAACP was as a member of the National Board of Directors, and more locally as an organizer and charter member of the New Haven chapter of the NAACP. And you can also see some other interesting community ties here. Reverend Goen was one of the people, his friend, his fraternity brother, who helped him in this work establishing the NAACP, but also, interestingly enough, John Hagen, who was the father of Yale's first African-American female graduate, Helen Hagen, and also Rachel Baker, who is the mother of future federal judge, Constance Baker Motley. So this was an interesting sort of collection of people. They themselves maybe did not have the opportunities that George Crawford did, but certainly in that next generation, you can see the influence on what their children were able to do. And in the next slide, we have a rare photo of George Crawford, and this is when he really kind of comes into the fullness of himself as an attorney. He leaves the probate court and strikes out on his own as an attorney at law. He's involved in a number of efforts civically, and the city government even recognizes that this young person is full of knowledge, a scholar, well-read, and very complete in his studies. And so he was active with the New Haven Zoning Commission. He helped in charter revision. He became the vice chair of the New Haven Housing Authority. A lot of people don't know that there were segregated YMCAs in New Haven. And so aside from the main one, which was for white men, there was a Black YMCA on Gulf Street and George Crawford was involved with the management of that organization. And he was also a longtime member of the Board of Managers of the Dixwell Community House. And he even had a career early on involved in politics and sort of what was remnants of the early colored conventions. Next slide. He also was active in a fraternity that at that time would have been somewhat secret. This was a collection of some of the finest intellectuals and professionals in the African American community. Membership was based in this organization on educational achievement and also so sort of social desirability and good fellowship. And the organization is the Sigma Pi Phi fraternity, founded in 1904. George Crawford, along with some outstanding giants like W.B. Du Bois and James Weldon Johnson, helped to form the New York chapter, which they call Boulets, the New York Boulets, Zeta Boulets. And even though Crawford was living in New Haven, his reputation and renown was far-reaching, and he certainly was contacted as someone to be a desirable beginning member. And this is a menu from a social gathering that the fraternity had. And this particular meeting was in New Haven, and it was held during the Yale-Harvard game. And this is a menu from that, what they call the ladies' night, where they brought wives and or female escorts and danced and fellowshipped with each other. And the Crawfords, along with the Goins and people like Charles Tribbett, would have been hosts to the organization while they were here in New Haven. And this organization, although sort of intentionally flying under the radar, would have been at the very top of Black fraternal and civic and social life across the country. And in the next slide, you can see that sort of these fraternal networks helped to not only introduce people to each other socially and provide sort of opportunities for people to have outposts as they traveled around the nation during, a very dangerous time related to race and segregation. But it gave people the opportunity to amplify their work and step into a national network. And so George Crawford was certainly seen as someone who was at the tops, and he was invited to be both a trustee of his alma mater, Talladega College, where he served for 50 years and was board chair. But he was also asked to serve as a trustee of Howard University, which was often called the capstone of Negro education, and he served as a vice chair and chairman of that board as well. Next slide, please. This is a picture of George Crawford in court in Hartford, Connecticut. And this was someone who was his reputation preceded him, and he was so great in his work that even white clients clamored for his services, particularly around issues related to municipal law. And George Crawford was at the center of a very famous lawsuit, and that was out of Waterbury, Connecticut, and it was commonly called the Waterbury case, where a number of public servants were involved in bribery and scandal and all kinds of alleged illegal activity. George Crawford was able to defend over 20 people, and he was able to get them all acquitted. And the actual people from that case that did get prosecuted were people who did not use the services of George Crawford. So his reputation for being a top attorney only grew after that and became legendary. Next slide. George Crawford didn't exist in a bubble. He certainly was supported in his work by his family, his wife, Cedilla Crawford, and his daughter, Charlotte Crawford. And it's very interesting when you talk about networks and legacy and why education is important and was so important to people who were existing in the shadow of slavery. Just one bit of exposure could sort of spark a chain of people who understood the importance of higher education. And certainly George's achievements and his network of friends who benefited from higher education were an inspiration, a call of duty to his daughter, Charlotte, who graduated from Wellesley College, first the New Haven High School, and then eventually, like her father, became a graduate of Yale University, and she graduated from the graduate school with a Ph.D. in languages. And for her career, she was a professor at Howard University, where her father was a trustee. Next slide. These I really want to introduce to the public because these photos are very rare, and they're from the collection of the Dixwell Congregational Church. These photos were unmarked, but if you're sort of fascinated by history like I am, you get to know people you don't really know in person. And so I was able to identify some people in the photo, and right in the middle of the flag is George Crawford in sort of that lighter gray suit. And he is sitting with men from the community who were affiliated not only with the Dixwell Congregational Church, but civic efforts happening in the city. And this was a testimonial. Next slide. Another rare photo that I wanted to make sure that I shared. This is a photo of the inside of the first Dixwell Congregational Church that was at 100 Dixwell Avenue. That building has since been demolished, but this is a rare peek inside. And George Crawford is in this photo as well. If you look on the left side of your screen, there is someone who's looking directly at the camera, white hair, glasses, and sort of a relaxed but steely gaze, and that is George Crawford during one of the church services. Again, a treasure from the Dixwell Congregational Church. Next slide. So I would say at the highest heights of his professional and legal career, George Crawford becomes the first Black corporation counsel for the city of New Haven. He was appointed by longtime acquaintance, Mayor Richard C. Lee. Now, the interesting thing here is that George Crawford was over 80 years old, I believe, when he was appointed by Mayor Lee. Mayor Lee sort of gives this story of growing up and working at the local, I believe, A&P as a grocery delivery boy. And he remembered delivering grocery to the home of this very tall, elegant Black man, and that man was George Crawford. So he had known Crawford since his youth. He had known his reputation as renowned as a fine attorney. And when he became mayor, he knew that he could have no one else but George, the famed George Crawford, to watch over the legal affairs of the city, and he appointed George Crawford. And this is an advertisement from the newspaper announcing George Crawford. Next slide. Now it's interesting because Crawford is the first person to become corporation counsel for New Haven, but a man named Harry Tolliver, who graduated from the Yale Law School 5 years after George Crawford, actually in the 20s served as the assistant corporation counsel for the city of New Haven. So a friend and someone who had a lot in common professionally and personally with George Crawford sort of made the beginning foray into that office, and Crawford took the top slot. And this is just a newspaper announcement announcing the resignation of Crawford from service in New Haven. Next slide. New Haven certainly was proud to have someone like George Crawford in their midst. I mentioned that he became sort of like a mythical, legendary figure. The community folks, have described Crawford as aloof and set apart. And so he wasn't always, I guess, in the minds of the citizens, very accessible, but somebody who was a larger than life figure. And he was certainly honored that way by the city of New Haven when they named their elderly apartment building on Park Street after him. And at that celebration, which was a public celebration in front of the building, dignitaries from all over came to be there and honor George Crawford, including the governor and iconic NAACP figure Roy Wilkins. And that building is still there on Park Street today. Next slide. This is a very interesting painting, and I want to talk about Crawford's legacy, but first I want to just talk a little bit about the painting that you see that accompanies this slide. This painting was painted for a portrait that was to hang in the Masonic building, which formerly was the Gulf Street Special School for Black students. And this was painted by a noted Yale art professor, Keller, who was a prize-winning artist, noted for abilities to draw and sketch. And this white gentleman was sort of the mastermind of portraying George Crawford, who he said had an abiding sense of force and dignity. And it was noted at the time, not only about this wonderful painting of Crawford, but the fact that this noted white art figure was the one to paint the painting. And then Crawford's legacy certainly is still with us through the Widow Sons Lodge of Prince Hall Masons in New Haven, the Dixwell Congregational Church, where George Crawford gave so much time, and to the congregational denomination in general, because he served the New Haven Association as its moderator. The Crawford legacy is still with us through the Greater New Haven chapter of the NAACP, through the Sigma Pi Phi fraternity, more concentrated Zeta Boulay in New York. The Black Bar Association in Connecticut is named after George Crawford, the Crawford Bar Association, not because he was the first attorney, but because of his reputation and what he did for cementing the reputation of possibility and excellence in Black lawyers. And then the New Haven Association of the United Church of Christ. Crawford's legacy also lives on in the next slide, in a strange sort of place that you might not expect. This very iconic piece of artwork in the background, which depicts scenes from the Amistad Revolt. This painting was commissioned by the American Missionary Association to be housed at Talladega College. George Crawford was a trustee of the American Missionary Association and personally reached out to noted artist and educator Hale Woodruff to put together the scenes for the mural, and this is one of them. And so, interestingly enough, some of these scenes are captured in the retold Amistad exhibit at the New Haven Museum. And so George Crawford has another New Haven piece. Not only was the Amistad incident tied to the city of New Haven, but the fact that Crawford was the driving force to commission this work on behalf of the American Missionary Association makes it that much more central to New Haven. A lot of this information comes through information that was handed down by Dixville Congregational Church. Also, Prince Hall Masons are very much so a treasure trove of keeping the memory of George Crawford alive. His letters were saved, some of his correspondence, that is, was saved by W.E.B. Du Bois and donated to the University of Massachusetts, along with other Du Bois papers. The Crisis magazine, where his good friend was the editor, kept up with the works and happenings of George Crawford and constantly talked about not only his works as an attorney and in civil rights, but also advertising for his various books. And then Black newspapers of the day, like the New York Age and the Pittsburgh Courier, were places, the Cleveland Plain Dealer, were places that constantly shared with Black America about all of the varied work of George Crawford. Crawford's legacy also really lives on in the hearts and minds of New Haven citizens who are still alive today. I want to call to attention longtime New Haven probate judge Jack Keyes, whose father was also a New Haven probate judge and had a direct relationship with George Crawford. Judge Keyes is a great source of information. Also, Ed Cherry, who was the first Black licensed architect in the state of Connecticut, had a professional and then personal relationship with George Crawford. And he often talks about what a wonderful man George Crawford was, and what a sort of source of inspiration and a source of professional knowledge. And both men being sort of in rarefied spaces for Black professionals, it was important that they had each other. And it was Ed Cherry who shared that in George Crawford's older years, he felt that George sort of paid a personal price being this mythical figure because he came across lonely, sort of shut off from having connections in the community. And then another person who shared some very personal reminiscence about George Crawford was noted longtime educator Aubrey Tompkins, who as a young man teaching in Connecticut was able to meet George Crawford through a dear family friend, and he developed his own personal relationship with George Crawford. And he said that not only was Crawford just a luminary, but he was just a really nice person, well-read, probably one of the most urbane people he had come into contact with. He was a regular holder of seats at the New Haven Symphony, and they shared a love of music. And when George Crawford couldn't attend, he would give Mr. Tompkins his tickets and have him go in his place. He said it was through George Crawford that he met the noted Marian Anderson as he was driving through town. George Crawford, who was a tall, sort of gallant man, was easily noticeable as he was driving through town, and he spots Mr. Crawford, and on his arm was the noted singer and sort of civil rights figure herself, Marian Anderson, who was standing with Crawford on New Haven streets as George Crawford had been her personal law attorney. And so without these local sort of treasures of memory, we wouldn't have these stories to share about the life and legacy of George Crawford. I'd also like to mention that Crawford's work and legacy is alive, and one person who I often talk about George Crawford, I talk to about George Crawford, is the recently retired probate judge and first Black probate judge in New Haven, Clifton Graves, who installed a picture of George Crawford in the probate court understanding that it was Crawford's early work in that court, starting as assistant clerk, that he is able or was able to become probate judge. And it's been my pleasure sharing stories about the life and legacy of George Crawford.